I'd like to start off by acknowledging the Monacan people. They are the traditional custodians of the land we're broadcasting from, and like to acknowledge and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Howard Morphy. Many of you already know Howard, but I want to give you a little bit of background. He is a distinguished professor of anthropology and was the founding director of the Research School of Humanities and the Arts at Australian National University. Prior to returning to ANU, where he did his PhD, but prior to returning there in 1997, he held the chair of anthropology at University College London. And before that, he was a Don at Oxford and curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. He's an anthropologist of art and a visual anthropologist, having co-edited 2 of the main source books in the respective fields, The Anthropology of Art, a Reader, and Rethinking Visual Anthropology. He's written extensively on Australian Aboriginal art with a monograph of Yolngu art ancestral connections, a general survey, Aboriginal art, which we use extensively at Kluge-Ruhe training docents, and most recently, Becoming Art, Exploring Cross-Cultural Categories. Howard conducted extensive fieldwork with Yolngu people of Northeast Arnhem Land in the Yirrkala region, beginning in 1974 through 6. But he continues to return there every year, side by side with Francis Morphy, a noted linguist, and his wife. And they have worked together on many projects, too numerous to mention, but I will just pull out a few on various films and multimedia projects, including a huge multimedia project of the artist Neritan Maimaru and a biography, exhibitions, and native title claims. They are giants in this field, and I met Howard in 1995 when I started working for John Kluge, but his history with the Kluge-Ruhe collection goes back even further, as you'll soon hear. He's been my mentor and my advisor throughout my career and has really guided the Kluge-Ruhe collection from its beginnings. He's also a founding member of our advisory council and is working very closely with us on the touring exhibition Madian, 8 Decades of Aboriginal Australian Bark Paintings from Yirrkala. I could say a lot more, but I'm pleased to share the screen with Howard. And I'm gonna ask a few questions of him. And what I hope we'll do is have just an engaged dialogue and then, you know, reminiscing and sharing some images, and then we'll take some questions. And we may take some questions as we go along as well. So welcome, Howard.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. And as we go along, people will hear how I think that the University of Virginia and John Kluge were incredibly fortunate to have you in the position of curator and subsequently director for all of these years. And it's been wonderful working with you. And I also might add that I will give an acknowledgement to the fact that I'm here in Ngunnawal country, in the city of Canberra. And interesting enough, although Canberra is not exactly how the word was pronounced in the Ngunnawal language, usually people refer to it as Gambri, at least it's a Ngunnawal word, unlike Charlottesville. So back to you.
Yes, named after Queen Charlotte.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, so my first question has to do with your very early involvement with the Ruhe collection. I'm going to share a couple of photos as you talk about how, you know, what was your first connection to Ruhe, and how, yeah, just go on.
Yeah, well, my first connection with Ruhe obviously was through reading his writing, and in particular the catalogues that he wrote for the exhibitions that travel across America, mainly to university galleries. And through that, one realized that Ed Ruhe was perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the early 1960s, writing about Aboriginal art, in particular, obviously the art from Arnhem Land, because that's where his collections were focused. And he corresponded with me a little. And then I met him and spent quite a lot of time over 2 or 3 days when he visited Canberra for the last time, a couple of years before his death, and where he stayed at University House. Edru was an extraordinary human being. I was actually very fortunate to meet him in person, because everybody who met him in person was charmed by him. He was a person of immense generosity, tremendous passion, an extraordinary intellectual, an incredible accumulator of archives and information, and not very, very good at publishing the material that he had accumulated. And he had in mind always a grand project, and that grand project, sadly, in a sense, outlived him through the Kluge-Ruhe collection in the end, because all of his archival material, as well as his paintings, are there. He was someone who, as a collector and an academic, a musician, had an incredible sort of aesthetic sense, but he also produced really valued documentation. So the Ruhe collection was incredibly well documented and became better documented as it lived in his apartment in Kansas, in Lawrence, but because of the incredible correspondence he carried out with people all over the world. He was one of the people who I would have carried on communicating with and visiting. I moved to Oxford to the Pitt Rivers Museum soon after the meeting with him in Canberra. And the next thing I heard was that he died, because I was approached by his estate and by the lawyers who were involved with it. He died intestate.
Howard, he actually died playing the piano.
Right.
And there is a picture of him playing the piano in his living room. You can see the Aboriginal art throughout his living room.
Absolutely. And of course, we actually, talking about aesthetic power, we see an unbelievable painting, I think there by Birikiji, Dalwongu painting there. And we see a whole series of works that he had collected. And they asked me to come and appraise the collection. So I was flown out to Lawrence, Kansas, and spent something like 2 weeks in a bank vault, going through every object in the collection, both describing it, adding more information to it, and doing evaluation. And left them with this large, work of my own, evaluating it for whatever they were going to do with it. And one of the things they were obviously doing it was for the, I imagine, the inland revenue to assess his estate for those kind of purposes.
Right.
And that was I suppose, the end of my collection with the Ruhe collection, before it eventually came part of John Kluge's collection. But there's,
I really love this photo, Howard. I just wanted to say, because you know that after Ed passed away, his students wrote a tribute to him. Yes, and one of the students wrote this beautiful essay about Ed's apartment, which was over a theater in Lawrence, Kansas, and about how he had so many artworks in his apartment that they were, in closets, and they were under the bed, and, like really his apartment was just filled to the brim with these amazing artworks. But I also want to just point out that that coffee table that's in the center of the photo is by Wendell Castle. And his family ended up giving that to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, where it is today. So it's just a really interesting thing. I guess Wendell Castle was in Lawrence, and he was became a really famous sculptor, but it's quite an unusual piece.
Yeah. No, indeed so.
So you want to talk a bit about John Kluge and how you got connected with him to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I got connected with John Kluge, first of all, without knowing that it was with John Kluge or having heard his name, because when I was at the Pitt Rivers Museum, I was visited by Maurice Tuckman, and who spent an afternoon with me, quizzing me. I mean, he was a major curator of contemporary art at Los Angeles County Museum, and a very important builder of collections there. And he said, well, if I was building a collection of Aboriginal art today, what would I do? So I had a long conversation with him about what I would do. I'd just been with Luke Taylor and spent 2 weeks at Reminisce with John Mundine, buying a collection, acquiring a collection for the British Museum, which we'd been asked to do. When I came back a month or so later, Maurice Tuckman was there. I'd already appraised the Ruhe collection, and I said, if you're going to build a collection, one of the things you want to do is get extraordinary works from the past, but equally important was to make collections in the present. And the best way to do that in the context of Australia, as far as I was concerned, was to work through art centres, because most of the outstanding work at that time was being done by art centres in remote areas, mainly of the Northern Territory and Central Australia. And I suggested areas where I thought at the moment really outstanding work was being done with excellent arts advisors. And of course, one of those was Reminisce, where John Mundine, who had at that stage already curated one of the most extraordinary both artworks, assemblages, collections, that was the Aboriginal Memorial, the 200 hollow log coffins that are now in the National Gallery forecourt in Canberra. And then I said goodbye to Maurice Tuckman. Didn't know what was happening, though I did hear that there was exciting purchases being made in Australia, but I was in Oxford at a distance, so this came sort of secondhand. Have you heard there's so-and-so in such and such? Then one evening, there was a knock on our door in our house in Oxford. And Sandra Figert and her then husband said, sorry, we're just here in Oxford for, more or less overnight. And would it be all right if we came and talked to you on the off chance? So I said, yes, we'll do. Welcome, come in. And they introduced themselves, and she they were both at the University of Virginia, and she was doing some work with someone called John Kluge and his collection. And she said, yeah, we've been asked to talk to you to see whether you had any suggestions as to how John Kluge might be able to carry on, developing his collection and so on and so forth. He's had some good advice already, but he's uncertain about, the direction that it should go. And he feels the need for more sort of contact with people who's been working in that area. So I had a long conversation with them, but one of the things I said that if he wants to seriously build a major collection, which he'd already started doing, in fact, is you need a curator. You need someone to work with it. And they said, well, what kind of person, in Charlottesville would be that? And I said, well, they said there aren't many experts in Aboriginal art. And I said, that's very true. Go to New York and find Fred Myers, but I'm sure he's not going to be a curator for John Kluge in his collection. So there's some advice. I said, it's important to find someone, and they must be someone who knows about Australian Aboriginal society today, preferably an anthropologist, because it's very unlikely that you'll find a non-anthropologist who would have that kind of knowledge there. And they said, oh, well, we'll go back to UBM, we'll come back to you. And I got a sort of email 2 or 3 days later saying, there is someone who's in the anthropology department finishing her doctorate. She's not working on art, she's working on conception, spirit conception, things like that, on Aboriginal people in Central Australia. And I said, I'm sure she'll be perfect. At least give her a go. And they then said, will you come out sort of in 2 or 3 weeks' time? So I said, okay, fine, I'll come out. So I was flown to Charlottesville. I was looked after very well. I was indeed, is the residence called the Colonnades or something like that in
Colonnades.
Yeah, I mean, it's right in the center of the University of Virginia, in this wonderful place. It was in the worst season of the year, so Charlottesville is not the time to go at that particular time. But I met Margo, and the collection was clearly unbelievable. Margo was an unbelievably well organized person, and although she didn't know an enormous amount about Australian Aboriginal art, she knew a lot about Central Australian Aboriginal society, and so that was the beginning. And here we are.
Can you see this picture? This is me and Howard going through the collection in January 1995.
Right.
When we were both brought in. And Howard, I actually found my notebook. Can you believe I still have this thing?
I said you were a systematic person, so if you hadn't,
it's hysterical. It's wonderful. But
yeah.
Anyway, this is one of the farmhouses, one of the dependencies on the farm. This one was at Blenheim Farm in a building they called the Athenaeum, or the library. And that's a pile. If Nicole could see this now, she'd have kittens, because that's a pile of bark paintings right there on the floor from Robin Ginning and a number of others around. We went through the whole collection, just one piece by, one piece, and you described all of the artwork to me and told me what was great about it. And I learned from you so much about the collection.
And it was
I just wanted to ask you about John Kluge as a collector and what impact he had on Aboriginal art. I know you mentioned the kind of the secrecy of the collection, this American billionaire buying paintings from art centers, but I'm curious what you think some of maybe the longer term, impacts were from the kind of collecting that he did in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
Before we got involved, because we're going to get to that.
yeah. Look, in a way, the reputation was as a result of his purchases, because he was someone who, in America, had recognized the extraordinary quality of the art that was being produced. He, like a number of other major American collections, was inspired by the Dreamings exhibition in New York in the Asia Society. And that was an incredibly important moment, because when you get an exhibition in New York, there are clearly gallerists who are open enough to say, and obviously entrepreneurial enough to say, well, let's see if we can add value to our own businesses by trying to exhibit some of the art that's involved there. And so John Kluge was able to begin by buying some Western Desert paintings. He then had the vision, having first of all being attracted by Western Desert art, to look much more broadly. And going to reminiscing was an inspired thing to do. Partly because it was at that moment in time when extraordinary artworks were being produced, partly because they were not being recognized sufficiently in Australia. I mean, John Mundine has written about the fact that it took a long while for the Aboriginal memorial itself to gain the kind of recognition that he wanted. John Mundine really thought that the new Parliament House in Canberra should be the location for really major collections made from right across Indigenous Australia. And he was unable to persuade them sufficiently for his own mind or for his interests as far as the art business at reminiscing was concerned to do that. So it was an incredible opportunity at that moment in time, and to make great collections of work from a particular region is something that people will learn about, and it's going to have that kind of impact. I think in the case of Australia, the writing an exhibition of Aboriginal art outside Australia has always been very, very important, and certainly since the period of the Second World War. I mean, there have been much more Aboriginal art outside Australia than people realize, and that has a tremendous impact back in Australia. So I think that's right.
I know John always said that he wanted to support the underdog. Those are his own words, you know, and when he saw Aboriginal art in New York, he felt that it was just astonishing, you know, so beautiful and such good quality. And he just didn't think the world knew about it, you know. I mean, there had been exhibitions, but so that's what he wanted to do. At least that's what he told me when we talked about it, was he wanted to really support artists and bring the level, you know, up to the place where you would be able to go into any museum or any gallery and see Indigenous Australian art.
Yeah.
Are we there yet?
Oh no, we're getting there, and what's happening in America and Europe continues to be unbelievably important back in Australia. I mean, the fact that it's
you're definitely there in Australia. I mean, you know, things have changed in Australia so much even since the 80s.
No, so it was fantastic. He also was involved in other kind of, in a way, sort of major innovative initiatives. So you've anticipated what I was going to say. I mean, this is obviously a painting by Lofty Ardayal, one of the really great painters from Western Arnhem Land. And this was an initiative that was developed by, obviously, a collaboration between the artists, between two people who had been very involved, of very different generations, in the sale and marketing and support of Aboriginal art. Flick Wright, who was at Owen Pally as an arts advisor quite early on in her career. Dorothy Bennett, who was one of the doyen art dealers of Aboriginal art, who was first of all the secretary of Stuart Scougal, whose collection of great barks and tiwi Pukamani poles, acquired by the Art Gallery of New South Wales in the late 1950s, was a kind of breakthrough moment in Australia. And she carried on working and developing Aboriginal art as a business. Quite a conservative person in some ways as far as her attitudes to art were concerned. And I think would David Cossey also have been involved in the development of that particular commission? An art dealer in South Australia, in Adelaide. So, well, works on paper. Owen Pally was not producing works on paper, and certainly not works on paper on this huge scale. There had been anthropologists who had used those kinds of materials in building collections, Ron Byrne in particular, Charles Manford, and later on myself. But there was a sort of question all the time about its authenticity. I mean, interestingly enough, long before this, I was phoned up in my office at the ANU by Mary Marr, who was another person who was working for Aboriginal Arts and Crafts Limited in Western Australia. And she said, "Oh, I'm phoning you up. Dorothy Bennett said I should phone you up because she said you were someone who collected paintings on cardboard and things like that. And so you could say whether, you know, paintings that were done in, you know, on wood or board or canvas or something like that had any authenticity." And I said, "Yeah, well, of course, yes." As long as the artist, the authenticity comes from the artist's work and their creativity rather than from the materials that they're using. And so Mary Marr said, "Good." And she was actually not referring to artists from Arnhem Land at all, but to the works of Rover Thomas, because she was the person who recognized the genius of Rover Thomas and those other artists in the Wellman area. And I mean, I don't know why she needed that reassurance, because the works were speaking very strongly in themselves. And just around about that time, Wally Caruana bought the extraordinary Rover Thomases at the National Gallery of Australia. But it's a sign of the times that people were uncertain about, you know, what Indigenous fine art was. And there was a kind of conservatism. Well, you can see this particular work here is done on paper, a surface that was prepared and then produced, in a sense, a canvas for the artists in Mumbalanya to work on. Well, who would have known in advance how that would have worked, what the impact would be? But the extraordinary thing is that almost every work in that collection is exceptional. Yeah. And John Kluge bought it. So, I mean, John Kluge, in a sense, was able to fund innovative developments that were very much in sort of continuity with the trajectory of these art traditions.
Yeah, let me jump in here because some of our audience might know this, but some won't. That right now we have an exhibition, and this work is in it at the Rotunda, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site at UVA. It's our signature building, you know, on the grounds of the university. And the exhibition is called Mongoi Mongoi, which means forever. And it is the kind of celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Kluge-Ruhe Commission. But also for that exhibition, we commissioned 2 new works, one by Gabriel Malngara and one by Joe Gunmala, both of who visited in January and spent a couple of weeks at UVA. And when they were here, Gabriel told us that he had prepared the backgrounds for these paintings. That he was a young man, he wasn't an established artist then, and he's now, you know, one of the leading artists there. But yeah, he was looking at them and you know, describing to us that what they were really trying to evoke is the feeling of the rock wall, which you know, that site is known for, Inulak Hill, and the beautiful rock art paintings there that are just layered and really catalog thousands of years of human artistic endeavor. So
and you can see that that particular medium also enabled people to produce the hand stencils that are another characteristic sort of feature of the rock art in that region there. So yeah.
And that's Bardiel's hands right there. Yeah. Okay, well, I wanna, now I've gotta get, oh shoot, where am I? I know I'm there, but you're not.
Yeah.
I wanna move on a little bit to when we started working together with the collection and the exciting times that we had building the collection together with what seemed like an unlimited budget back then. And, you know, we had 4 areas that we wanted to build, and you very much, you know, advised the areas, you know, based on that whole catalog of what we've done of the collection and realizing that there were gaps. Like, you know, there were no works from Yirrkala after Ed Rue. And so we did a major commission of monumental bark paintings from Yirrkala artists, from Yolngu artists. We also commissioned works from Maningrida, Balgo, and Ewan Demu. So I'd like to just visit each of those places, and I've got a few images to show. And maybe you could just recollect a little bit about the Yirrkala commission to start off with.
Right. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, it was very exciting. Also, I suppose I should say that we were also able to add to the collection through acquiring works that were made available to auctions. And it was at that moment in time when suddenly people had become interested in Aboriginal art as fine art, where that shift happened. And at the same time, odd things happened, like one of the great collections in Australia, the Robert Holmes Accord collection, had a change of curators, and suddenly a whole series of works, wonderful works, turned out to be deaccessioned from there. So we were able to look at Sotheby's catalogues and say, gosh, this is ridiculous. Should we buy them? And as you say, I don't think John Kluge ever turned down a suggestion that we made in that area. So we were very, very fortunate. And look, I clearly, having worked at Yirrkala for a long time, had a strong interest in Yolngu art. But I also thought that the collection of big barks at the Art Gallery of New South Wales were a very important moment in the recognition of Aboriginal art. There had been a subsequent commission of some large bark paintings for the National Gallery of Victoria, but I thought some, you know, whatever it would have been, nearly 40 years, 40 years on, was the time to make another major commission of large barks. And so we put the proposal forward. I was still then at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, teaching in Oxford. And so one evening I phoned up Andrew Blake at Dear Colour. I'd already had some interaction with Andrew Blake. He does, his with Balaka, that's absolutely wonderful. And so I just phoned him up and I said, well, what would you think? If you were asked to make a collection of large barks for John Kluge in America. And he said, we'd start tomorrow. I suppose in a way it's not surprising. I mean, Andrew would have obviously known about the Ramaginning Commission and would have seen the opportunity. But it was also a time when in Australia, I mean, it is not easy running art centers. It's one of the hardest jobs you could ever have. You have an extraordinary collection of people that you're working with. I mean, John Kluge in that sense is absolutely right, because they are not as connected with the wealth of Australia as many other Australians are, we'll say it that way. So this provided a huge opportunity. And, John Kluge obviously enabled us to go to Australia and be part of the building of this collection, because in a sense, that was the other important thing. One wanted to have collections that were well documented, and it's carrying on that trajectory of Ed Rue, because Ed Rue indeed himself, although he was not a comfortable person in the Australian bush, felt that it was desirable, almost necessary for him to be there where some of those paintings that he was collecting were being made.
Oh, look.
So here we are. We were pretty comfortable in the bush, as you can see.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here, Howard, because I've got a little surprise for you.
All right.
So I also found my notebook from this trip. I never take notes like this anymore, but I'm going to read a little passage if you don't.
Right.
And I'm going to read another little passage in a minute. But this is about the bush trip to Ruinella, to visit Dula and his family. Gombally was gone to ceremony. Okay, the boys were playing the yidaki when we arrived. We were invited to sit down in the shade. Delivered cigs to Dula. Andrew explained our visit. Howard reminded Dula of knowing each other years ago. He didn't remember until much later when he remarked, "Oh, you used to be a skinny fella."
Oh dear.
Took everyone down to the river for water and to inspect the broken pump, which could not be started despite everyone trying it. Went for a swim in the water hole. There you are. Cold water.
No.
Later told there were no saltwater crocs there, only freshwater ones. No worries. Okay, we'll get back serious now. But I want to come back to that in a minute because we had an adventure on that trip for sure. Oh, let's just look back at this work.
Yeah.
This is Gombali's work, right?
Yes, yes. Absolutely wonderful. I mean, this is here. Yeah, good heavens.
Just
I mean, Gombali,
tell them where this is. This is, a long way away from your kala.
It's about, well, it was about 4.5 hours drive on dirt roads. How far would that have been? It's about 250 kilometers, something like that.
And this piece of bark is about 13 feet long.
It's huge. It's colossal.
Huge. The two that two men made are the two largest in the collection.
Yeah, Yeah.
And here they are, this is just under a shade, and this is where it's being painted and created. So just to kind of give it a little bit of perspective for people who maybe haven't been out there.
Yeah, and also on the logistics of the size and scale of these paintings and the issues of transporting them. You can't roll them up as if they were canvases. I mean, that also relates, to the nature of some other works. I mean, the hollow log coffins themselves. One of the reasons that you don't see larakeech in museum collections until, really the end of the 20th century was the transport costs are enormous, and the logistics of moving that kind of material. These barks are, just wonderful. I mean, you can see this. It's really difficult actually to see all of this painting. We can see those two baru there. The large barks gives people the canvas whereby they can paint a whole series of interconnected themes from different places or different estates in their current country.
I'm just going to jump in quickly. We have a question from Shane. He's asking, was the bark collected at the painting location for the big monumental barks? Were those collected on location?
Yes, I mean, they as long as there was stringy bark forests around, which there are in most parts of that part of Arnhem Land.
I recall a photo that Andrew sent that had a bunch of barks that they had collected that they maybe were distributing out to the artists. So I don't know if it was that process. They were, they had some young guys go out and get the barks and deliver them.
Yeah, what happens in the case of, I mean, look, the way that how are barks collected from the trees? Okay, the barks are collected because you have to go climb high up in the tree, make a cutting all the way around, cut all the way down, and then you peel the bark off the tree. So one of the issues you've got is actually having a ladder that will enable you to go that high. Now, people did simply use forked trees to climb up. And when I was doing field work in the 1970s, 80s, on the whole, big barks of that's not quite as big as that. That's unusually big because you've got to find a tree that has bark through that way, would have done that. What happened at the time that these were made is that people would use the roof of the cabin of a Toyota as the ladder to get high up enough in the tree. So people would go out on bark collecting expeditions with young men, with someone like Andrew driving the Toyota and sometimes helping get the bark off. People always collected barks in substantial numbers and would store them as a pile flattened down with heavy grinding stones, because the barks need to be matured over a period of several weeks so that they won't then bounce back immediately into the desired state of curling around the trunk of a tree.
So Howard, I just want to jump back into this trip because there's a few other things to tell about, and one was from Doula's remote camp, we actually took even a further trip into the bush, which was intended to go maybe hunting for some geese in the swamp there. We had 13 people in this troop carrier and a couple of dogs, if I remember correctly. And I just want to read something that I wrote in this notebook, because I talk about how Andrew was knocking down small trees with the Toyota bull bar. We went through several kinds of country, spent maybe 2.5 to 3 hours driving through bush until finally arrived at a swamp surrounded by shell middens, old camping place. Sound of geese in the distance. Doula went off with the gun to shoot. One shot was heard. At this point, later afternoon in long shadows, we were eager to turn back. Doula came back empty-handed. Geese too far away in swamp to retrieve, even though he may have hit one. Andrew turned back on our tracks, but people had been setting fire to the country all along, uneasy about backtracking. That's what it looked like. First time he lost the tracks, they steered him off course, and here we were with the sun going down and bushwhacking new track through difficult country, slow going. We asked for the easiest route to the road. Sun going down and we came to a creek. All the other creeks we had built bridges over, now it was getting dark. And basically we got bogged in that creek. Andrew tried a winch, but it seemed to be broken. We jacked up the front and built underneath it with more wood, dug out the undercarriage. Nothing worked. 1 hour and lots of work. He tried the winch again in complete darkness and it worked. Anyway, we keep on going and then we stake a tire. And you and Andrew say to Doula, can we just camp here? And Doula says to his wife, do you have any blankets? And she said no. And he said, no, keep on going. So the way that I remember it is that Andrew ended up navigating us out through a star that he could spy out the window. And we finally arrived onto the road.
We hit the road, yeah.
To everybody's delight. But it was a long trip, a long, hard trip, but an amazing trip too.
Yeah.
That's such a fun story, Margo. I just have a question about whether these really large monumental barks were a new practice in your kala, and was that idea prompted by Kluge or by you two?
No, neither. No big monumental barks weren't a new idea. Probably the largest bark that I've ever seen was collected by Donald Thompson from Callerton Bay, that I think is going to be exhibited in America as part of the Meridian exhibition, done by a great Yolngu elder, Wangu, and 3 of his sons. And that is bigger than Doula's one. So people had always produced barks of different sizes. I think the regular size of bark paintings that are in museum collections were the result of both transport factors and the fact that Yolngu paintings are done, in particular ceremonial paintings, on the human chest. So actually the size of an individual painting done as a ceremonial context, as a flat painting, is about the size of a large chest or a bit bigger, okay? But in the case of hollow log coffins, which are these very tall cylindrical poles, then they would be painted from top to bottom all the way around, and they would have a similar collection of paintings that represented different clan estates associated with the person who had died and was being buried there, for example. And in a ceremonial context, what you have is the performance of these different stages in ancestral creation journey and so on and so forth in different modes. So you might have a sand sculpture and another sand sculpture, and there'll be a painting on a body coffin lid, or there may be posts that are erected and painted. So the structure of connecting together a whole series of different themes that were then produced, for example, on these tall barks, was very much something that Yolngu have always done. The same thing applies if we were answering questions on the large Central Australian canvases that are being produced. What they are in a sense manifestations of things that would be enacted in ceremonial performances in different modes and media. So you have to see Aboriginal art as something that is rather like, you know, grand opera. It includes musical performances, visual performances, sound, dance, everything like that. And in a sense, bark paintings are, you know, in that sense, part of a much more sort of complex whole. But the answer is no, they weren't something that were introduced by, certainly not by Margo or John Kluge or the Art Centre there. And the Schuylkill barks, which were the thing that we had in mind in doing this commission at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, although not quite as large as that, were again ones that were done at Yirrkala by Indigenous artists, you know, so yeah. It's so, yeah, exactly. Scale is one of those incredible things about Aboriginal art, that people can produce things from almost the size of a matchbox, which would be, you know, a condensed engraving on a small message stick or something like that, to a huge ceremonial ground. And transformations of things into different scales is one of the characteristics of Aboriginal creativity, I think.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about Karku.
Wow, yes. Over to you, Margo, because I.
So you weren't at the. I don't know why I can't do this, but hold on. You weren't at Yuendamu for this.
No.
It's not letting me. I'll just put it up there. But after going to Yirrkala, we went to Maningrida, and then to Balgo together, and then you went back to Canberra and I went to Yuendamu to camp outside of Karku, which is a red ochre site. And actually, if I can go back, yeah, there it is up in this hill, or it is the hill. And then this painting was commissioned, and soon after this camping trip, where the stories about the site were sung and reenacted in dance, people came back and began painting on this painting, which is 22 feet wide and about 9.5 feet high. But this was one of several of these monumental paintings that came from Yuendamu for other museums, and that was something that was going on at the time. So can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, well, no, I can, because I knew a lot about the initiative at Yuendamu, which was partly an initiative originally by women artists. Yuendamu people, Walbury people, had been very much part of the Western Desert movement of Papunya. Well, a lot of Walbury people were involved with paintings that were being produced elsewhere. But at Yuendamu itself, it was with an anthropologist called Françoise Dussart at the Australian National University, who actually was working with the women who I think needed some money in order to buy a Toyota, to go out hunting, gathering, collecting wood for carving, and so on and so forth. So the women's the art movement at Yuendamu started with that particular initiative. And then men started joining in the practice as well. So Yuendamu art developed after that at Papunya. And I guess at the time that we were involved with building the collection, it was suddenly becoming well known. I was visited in Oxford by someone representing the community at Yuendamu who worked with the artists, and wanting to know if a museum would like to acquire the collection, a collection from there. and didn't. Pitt Rose Museum didn't have any money for buying artworks, but the British Museum actually linking in was able to acquire, and it was one of the first institutions to do so, a major collection of Yuan Damu canvases. Then I heard, and you probably heard as well, that Yuan Damu was having, again, a sort of community initiative to go back to country, back to people's lands, and do large canvases that encompassed the ancestral tracts, the song lines, the dreamings associated with those particular areas. One or two had already been commissioned. I was familiar with them from photographs and things like that. So we thought, well, why don't we commission one? Which was actually a bold gesture, because you actually have to commit yourself to buying something that has not yet been produced, that's on such an enormous scale that you're not sure how on earth people would do it, whether it would cohere together. And so, yes, and then you take over, because you actually witnessed it all being done, and I didn't.
Well, I didn't really witness it being done, just, you know, what led up to it. Yeah, but it was really interesting, because when we started working on art from the land, and that's the last thing I really wanted to talk about with you tonight, we were able to get photos of the painting of Karku and share them with Françoise Dussart, who wrote the chapter on Yuan Damu painting, and she saw some really interesting things in the photos. She was able to actually see that certain things were painted and then later painted over, and you know, and because she knew the people and the art form so well, she knew what was going on, and she could talk to people and confirm what her ideas were about what happened as that painting was being made, which is a very interesting story. And actually, we can direct people to Art from the Land to read more about that. But just on that topic, I wanted to, because it was your idea that Kluge really have a catalog about the collection that would share the collection with the world. You know, there was all this secrecy about this collection in America, and a big collection, a very good collection. And so this was, the idea was share it with people who can write the kinds of chapters that will make it known and have a lot of great images in it. And so can you just, you're the one who put this together. Can you just describe who was involved and how it worked?
Well, again, it was a great opportunity. So one of the things that I thought was important was that we should have people writing essays who had been centrally involved, either working with the artists in the community, as in the case of Françoise Dussart and Chris Watson, obviously myself, Luke Taylor, all people who had been very influential in the development of institutional collections of Aboriginal art, and in writing in general terms about it. So I mean, Wally Caruana, who really built the foundational collection at the National Gallery of Australia, and who was part of that process of involving Jim Mollison to suddenly say, well, actually, Indigenous Australian art is some of the great art that's being produced in the world today. The National Gallery has really got to have this major collection of it. So Wally was a fundamental figure in this. And of course, John Mundine was not only someone who was deeply knowledgeable about the art of Rawangini, he was knowledgeable about Aboriginal art more generally. He'd been involved with it for a long period of time. He was a curator. So he, again, was someone who was involved in the whole. And we did also need, obviously, I mean, someone like yourself, who was the best possible person to contextualize the history of the building and development of the collection. And we also decided that it provided the opportunity for people in America like Fred Myers and Nancy Mann, great experts in Australian Aboriginal art in different kind of ways, to be involved in the symposium. Because we had the kind of resources that Kluge could give us, we were actually able to have a week in Morven, in his estate, where we were able to get people in advance to produce the drafts of the catalogues. It's very, very difficult to do that, but if you're offering people to, you know, fly to America and spend a week in this wonderful environment, all the rest of it, wonderfully people produced terrific sort of essays. And we invited Nancy Mann, whose work on Wildberry iconography was one of the fundamental original works into the nature of Indigenous Central Australia, in particular, representational systems. She an extraordinary intellectual. Sadly, she died earlier this year. We actually have a transcript of all the conversations that happened there. And they are going to be very important archivally. And wonderful interactions between, you know, Fred Myers and Nancy Mann and Françoise Dussart and Chris Watson, who built the Balgo collection. Yeah, there's John Mundine in the background there. I don't know who those other two people are. Yeah, yeah. So look, it was great. And we were able to produce the book that we wanted. So, you know, Maureen Mackenzie designed it. Francis Morphy did all the editorial work for it. So, you know, as a catalogue, it was great. And at that time, we had no idea whether this collection would be together in 10, 15 years' time. No idea. Probably no idea whether it would be together in 5 years' time.
So we actually have a question that is very closely related to the idea, the ideas that you're talking about, Howard. So the question is, what do you view as the, I'm going to say 3 most important subjects for further academic research related to Aboriginal art? Importance of publication. Good question about that.
What, now or then, or what?
Now.
Well, look, now I think that we've reached a stage where Australian Aboriginal art has a kind of global recognition, where its diversity is now understood. And one of the extraordinary things about Australian Aboriginal art is that you can't suddenly, it's rather talking about European art. You can't suddenly say, oh, well, we can encompass this, you know, in a few exhibitions or, you know, a couple of books. You can't. And it's on trajectories that are dynamic, that are, you know, encompassing people who have really quite different cultural backgrounds and histories and so on and so forth as well. So I don't think there are, you know, 3 important questions. I think that we actually now need the resources, in particular the resources, I think, in Australia, to really work on the history, the documentation, and provide support for Indigenous art, you know, practitioners in the same way that, I mean, I was going to say in the same way that other arts are supported in Australia, but in fact, there's a huge need for art in general to have much greater support. So I don't think there is there aren't 3 questions. We need more people to be involved in Aboriginal art history and writing about it, And that way, what you'll create is the body of knowledgeable people who can carry on building understanding of Aboriginal art and appreciation of it. So yeah.
And I would just add that we need more biographies of artists, and we need more documentation of artists' words, you know, their own words, because when we're looking around at Kluge-Ruhe to try and interpret, you know, artworks for our audience, we really want to use the artist's words. And sometimes that, you know, there's just not much to go on. So that's always really helpful. Are there more questions, Lauren, when I answer?
Yeah, there is another question, and otherwise we're pretty well caught up on questions. So if anyone has any, feel free to write them in the Q&A. I think a few folks were raising their hands, so please just feel free to write your questions within the Q&A function of the webinar. The other question was brought up when you all were talking about your Kala and your adventures there, and there was a request that you talk a little bit about the artists who are pictured, which artists they are, and also what were their lives like at that time. I think they said, what are their lives like? I presume they meant at that time. So
I mean, the simple answer is that I mean, you have to look at the whole sort of history of colonization in that part of northern Australia, which happened much later in some ways that most people understand. So it was only really in the 1930s that the Yirrkala region came under Australian government control through the mediation of missions. So Yirrkala mission was established in the 1930s. And then over time, government policy and other things meant that people tended to focus all of the resources on the mission settlements. I mean, the idea of trying to get Aboriginal people to be sedentary in Arnhem Land in a particular place. So although people still visited their own estates frequently, they tended then to spend much of the time at the main settlements, and often because Aboriginal people themselves wanted their children to take the advantage of schooling and so on and so forth. In the 1970s, there was something called the outstation movement, in which people then felt able to move back to their land, in which the Land Rights Act actually gave them ownership and security of tenure in the case of a large number of people in the Northern Territory of their traditional lands. So what we were looking at that time when we were building that collection was a whole series of small communities in people's clans estate, where people were carrying on very much living off the land, hunting, gathering, fishing. At the same time, the making of arts and crafts was a growing part of their economy. So when we visited those communities, we were actually visiting communities where there was strong continuity between the life that their great-great-grandfathers had lived before European colonization, and yet at the same time a strong engagement and understanding of the importance of the outside world and getting recognition and getting the kind of resources that would enable them and their children to continue relatively autonomously in their own countries. And this is still a kind of struggle that people are very much involved in. It's a very hard struggle because it's continually dealing with a government that fails really to recognize or give agency to the people themselves in their own trajectory. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Howard. That's great. We had a question from Dory, who is just asking if there's anything else that you all wanted to share about John Kluge and his enthusiasm about Aboriginal art.
Well, we might go on to that as I mean, Margo, because I suppose we're a matter of timing, but you probably want to go on to the transformation of the collection to one in the University of Virginia,
Well,
do you?
I mean, I think that, so, you know, sure, we just want to wrap it up too, but yeah, you know, John was interested initially in building a private museum for his Aboriginal art collection, and he had built a carriage museum. And that was part of the intention when Howard and I first started working with the collection. We actually put together some design ideas. And then at one point he did ask us, he had made the decision, he wasn't, what he used to say, I'm not buying any green bananas, because he was getting older and he didn't want to, you know, put 10 years into building a museum. So he wanted us to consider 3 different futures for the collection. One would be go back to Australia to join a major state or national museum in Australia. The second would be to go to the Smithsonian. And the third would be to go to UVA or a similar university. And we wrote up our recommendations that really, you know, pointed to UVA in that at UVA, it could be something extraordinary that would stand out and have a life, an ongoing life, and some prominence, you know, whereas we felt that within a larger institution, the collection might end up in storage or, you know, not being used as actively as it could be used at a university. And he did take that advice and made the gift to the University of Virginia. But as far as, you know, my reminiscing about John, you know, I got to know him a lot better when he was older, near the end of his life. And I think that he, not only did he want to support the artist, you know, and kind of give the artist opportunity, but also he was someone who just, you know, felt deeply the spirituality of the artwork, or at least that's what he believed, you know. So he loved living with Aboriginal art. He didn't memorize the names of artists. He didn't dive deeply into their background or history or biography, but he really was comforted and enjoyed Aboriginal art in his surroundings. And he ended up keeping a part of the collection that was in his homes. And some of that rejoined the Kluge-Ruhe collection later. Howard, anything else you want to say?
No, I mean, you're right. He loved Aboriginal art. So, I mean, it wasn't that, and he had huge collections. I mean, he was a passionate collector of just about everything, though he did have, you know, the artists who were, he favored. I think he had the biggest collection of John Lennon Aliener in the world at one stage or something like that. So, and huge collections of posters. He had the largest collection of Belgian carriages and so on. So he was a great collector, but it wasn't the Belgian carriages that were in his house and his hotels in New York. It was definitely Aboriginal art.
Thank you both. I'm learning a lot here too, so that's really fun. I answered a question and then realized that maybe I answered it too quickly and assumed I knew an answer. Someone was asking about Ruhe and his formal training, and to my knowledge, he did not have any formal training as an art historian or as an anthropologist because he was a professor of English. But I just wanted to confirm that with both of you. Is that correct? Okay.
It is. But, I mean, he was a musician, as Margo noted. And he was someone who was always passionate in music and film and art generally. So yeah, and poetry, and yeah, exactly. So yeah. Oh, we can't hear you.
We just have one last question. Sorry about that. And then we'll end on that note. But someone was just asking how involved that Kluge was in the development of the museum.
Of the Kluge-Ruhe Museum.
The Kluge-Ruhe. Mm-hmm.
Wasn't really involved in the development of the Kluge-Ruhe Museum. You know, the gift and he did make sure that I was employed to work with the collection, and I thank him very much for that. But he wasn't, you know, for quite a period of time, he wasn't really very involved at all in Kluge-Ruhe at UVA. He was involved with UVA. He ended up giving his home, Morven, his estate, and 8,000 acres of land to the university. And, you know, we actually kind of connected again years later, and he got more involved in Kluge-Ruhe at that point. I went down to visit him in Florida, and he wanted to start our advisory council. He, you know, founded basically our advisory council. Howard's a founding member of the advisory council. John Kluge asked his friend Tony Bennett to be on the advisory council, and Tony was on the council for 3 years, and a number of other people. So, you know, but then that same year, just before the advisory council met for the first time, he passed away. And so that was really sad for us. But I did get to spend quite a bit of time with him in those last few years, and I enjoyed getting to know him. And he really was proud of Kluge-Ruhe and the success that we've had. And he was really grateful that Howard, you know, guided us so well over the years, as I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think one might sort of connect what Margo said about his decision finally to leave the collection with the University of Virginia, with its subsequent trajectory. Also with the fact that he created an advisory committee, because I think Margo and I both saw this as one of the world's great collections. And we saw that if it was linked in with a major university that had a strong interest in subjects that would fit in very much with the that it would have a long-term trajectory in which people would recognize its value, recognize the richness of the resource, recognize the fact that actually through EdRu, it had one of the most important archives and resources for research into Aboriginal art. And gradually this has become recognized. And over that period of time, in particular because of Margo, it's become a model of what a university art museum can be. So it has the very high end, really, conservation and storage for a museum of this size. It has a very good educational program, Lauren and others, and terrific engagement with the community. And the thing about Aboriginal art is that it's not one thing, it is many, many things. And the university has actually recognized that aspect of it. And I think the fact that we were beginning with an acknowledgement of the Monacan people is a sign of how it links in with Indigenous movements on a global kind of basis. And those Indigenous movements are global. So if the collection had been, you know, sold back to Australia, which it's unlikely that any of those institutions would have been able to afford, then in some ways it would have been lost. But it's become this very important part of connection. And the Australian High Commission or the, not High Commission in America, but embassy, has been incredibly supportive. And it has become a focal point for Indigenous Australians to move their art outside. And I think the other point that is missing in what we were saying is that John Kluge's collection, partly probably because of the advice that he had at that moment in time, was fundamentally on what people might have said was traditional Aboriginal art. Margo and I, from the very beginning, wanted to expand that. So the collection now has a very, very strong representation of contemporary artists, from Indigenous artists from all the way across Australia. And that's been a very important moment. And again, that links in with global understandings of the ways in which Indigenous peoples can be very much part of the present and future, but also deeply connected to the history of their place. So I think that's what I can say there.
I think that's a great place to finish, actually. So I just want to thank you both, because this was so fun for me, and I know that we've already gotten a lot of compliments in the Q&A on how many people enjoyed this. So thank you both, and a great success for our first one of these, and we're looking forward to many more. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you so
everybody.
much.